Most serial killers act alone. They hide in the dark, driven by personal demons. But what if the monster wasn't one person? What if it was a group? What if the people next door, your neighbors, your co-workers, believed they were saving the world by torturing and killing others? In the quiet suburbs of South Australia, a group of men came together not to serve justice, but to erase those they called unworthy. They smiled in family photos, they hosted barbecues, and in secret, they were turning a disused bank vault into a chamber of horror. They didn't kill for money, they killed for ideology. They believed they were cleansing society, one body at a time. But what they left behind, sealed in barrels, soaked in acid, wasn't justice. It was something much darker, something so twisted, so cold, that even seasoned investigators called it a nightmare made real. This is not just a story of murder, it's a story of belief taken too far, of morality turned into a weapon, and of ordinary people becoming monsters. They looked like ordinary men, the kind you pass by at the grocery store or nod at in the post office. In South Australia's quiet suburbs, they blended into the background, middle class, unremarkable. But behind their polite smiles was a truth so horrifying it would forever change how the country viewed small-town safety. These weren't just killers. They were believers. They saw themselves as righteous executioners. Cleansing society, they said, fixing what the law wouldn't. And the people they chose to destroy, they called them scum, parasites. But many were just vulnerable, helpless, and in the end, defenseless. The nightmare began in the early 1990s, in a suburb of Adelaide. It started not with blood, but with an idea. John Bunting, charismatic, intense, and disturbingly persuasive, was the core. He talked about purging evil, protecting children, punishing abusers. On the surface, his words carried a sense of moral urgency, but beneath it all was a festering hatred. He wasn't hunting justice, he was hunting control, and he used morality as a weapon to recruit others into his ideology. He drew in Robert Wagner, a man shaped by trauma and abuse. Then came James Vlasakis, a teenager manipulated through threats and false loyalty. Mark Hayden, the quiet one, joined later. Together they formed something dark, something calculated. They weren't impulsive or chaotic. They planned, they documented, they took trophies. Victim after victim was added to Bunting's growing list of the unclean. Some were accused sex offenders, others were simply disabled, mentally ill or inconvenient. It didn't matter. Once you were on his list, you were already dead. The first known murder was Clinton Trezise in 1992. Clinton was a drifter, not a criminal, not a predator, just someone vulnerable enough to be targeted. Bunting killed him in his own home. And when it was done, he smiled. He told others it felt good, like he'd done something noble. He buried the body in a shallow grave and went on with his life like nothing happened. But the floodgate had opened, and blood had begun to fill it. The next victim, Ray Davies, was disabled and socially isolated. Bunting accused him of being a pedophile, with no real evidence. That didn't matter. He dragged Ray to a shed, tortured him for days, then killed him. He recorded the man's screams, and worse, he kept them, played them for others, bragged about them. This wasn't justice. It was pleasure. It was ritual. A performance of pain. Bunting had something he called the spider wall, a collage of photographs and notes pinned to a wall in his house. Each face was a target, a person he hated, people he planned to kill. And one by one those faces disappeared. He used nicknames, symbols, threads connecting their names. The wall wasn't just decor, it was a kill list. One he stared at every day, one he updated with grim satisfaction. By 1997, the killings had become more frequent and more organized. Victims were tortured into giving up their PIN numbers, their belongings. Their identities were stolen. In some cases, they were forced to call family members, pretending to have left town. These phone calls were often made under extreme duress, sometimes after days of torment. The killers used these voicemails to cover their tracks, to give the illusion that the victim was still alive. It worked. for years. The group's primary method of disposal was grotesque. They stored the bodies in barrels, 55-gallon drums filled with hydrochloric acid. The plan was simple: dissolve the flesh, destroy the evidence, and hide the truth. The barrels were kept in a disused bank vault in Snowtown, a small town with fewer than 500 residents. The smell alone was unbearable. But no one in the town thought to question it. No one imagined that the vault in their quiet little bank was a mass grave. What's more chilling is how involved the killers' families became. Vlasakis brought his half-brother to Bunting, and he became a victim. Hayden's wife helped cover for them. These weren't strangers. These were people bound by blood and proximity. And in this circle of trust, the rules of normal society no longer applied. Morality was redefined. Killing wasn't wrong. It was justice. Pain wasn't cruelty. It was purification. One of the most disturbing murders was that of Barry Lane. Barry was openly gay, flamboyant, and once in a relationship with Wagner. When the relationship soured, Barry became a target. They abducted him, tortured him, and forced him to record a message claiming he was moving to Queensland. Then they killed him. They laughed about it afterward. Bunting described it as getting rid of a degenerate. But what it really was hatred. Pure and unfiltered. Many victims were chosen simply because they could be controlled. Frederick Brooks was just 18. He had an intellectual disability. They tricked him, then killed him. Michael Gardner, another man with disabilities, was similarly lured. No trial, no chance, just death. And when police later reviewed the patterns, it became clear. This wasn't about moral cleansing. This was about dominance, power, and choosing those least able to fight back. The killers used fear to bind each other. Vlasakis participated in multiple murders, but was also a victim of psychological terror. He was threatened, beaten, and brainwashed. In court, he described the killings in brutal detail, how victims screamed, how they begged, and how Bunting would smile, coldly, when the life left their eyes. Vlasakis' testimony would later become the backbone of the prosecution. But at the time, he was just another cog in the machine. As the body count grew, suspicions finally reached police. But even then, the investigation moved slowly. The lies had been so carefully laid. The victims had been made to vanish so thoroughly. And in a society that often ignores the marginalized, their disappearances weren't treated as emergencies. But when detectives finally followed the threads, everything led to one place: the vault in Snowtown. When authorities opened the vault, the air was toxic. They found barrels stacked like furniture, each one filled with acid, each one hiding human remains. The forensic team had to take breaks every few minutes. The stench wasn't just rot, it was something worse. Something that seemed to carry the weight of suffering, of screams absorbed into the walls. Some officers vomited, others cried. It was, according to one investigator, a chamber of evil. Even after the discovery, the killers showed little remorse. Bunting remained defiant. He called himself a soldier, said he had no regrets. Wagner was cold, mechanical. Hayden denied everything. Only Vlasakis showed signs of guilt. But even then, it was buried under years of manipulation and fear. The trial would become one of the longest in Australian history. The testimonies were graphic, the evidence overwhelming. But what haunts people most isn't just what happened, it's how long it took to stop, how easy it was for evil to hide in plain sight, how neighbors, friends, even family members never noticed or never questioned the signs. Because in towns like Snowtown, people mind their own business. They don't ask too many questions, and sometimes that silence kills. What drives a man to believe he's cleansing the world while burying bodies in acid? What convinces him he's moral while watching someone scream for their life? These aren't just questions for a courtroom. They're questions we ask ourselves when we look at the shadows in our own communities. Because the scariest monsters aren't always the ones who hide. Sometimes they're the ones who stand proudly in the light, believing they're heroes. And this was just the beginning. The most horrifying details, what they did to the bodies, how they were caught, and the full extent of the manipulation was yet to come. But by the time it ended, nothing in Snowtown would ever be the same again. The trial began under a cloud of horror. Journalists described it not as a criminal case, but a descent into madness. The courtroom, normally a space of order and procedure, now echoed with the stories of barrels, acid, and betrayal. What unfolded wasn't just murder, it was ideology turned ritual. One by one, victims' names were read aloud. Most had been forgotten by society long before their bodies were found. And now, in death, they were reduced to forensics, to bone fragments, to charred IDs and plastic containers of teeth. James Vlasakis, barely an adult himself, was the prosecution's key witness. His testimony lasted weeks. Each day, he described another murder, another scream, another lie told to cover up the horror. He recounted how John Bunting would force victims to give up their ATM passwords while being tortured, how Bunting would laugh during the pain, mocking them, calling them filth. Vlasakis's voice trembled, not just from fear, but from guilt, because he wasn't just a witness, he had helped. There was no remorse in Bunting's eyes. During the trial, he stared down the courtroom like a man certain of his beliefs. When the audio recordings were played, of victims begging for their lives, sobbing, choking, he didn't flinch. Wagner sat still beside him, his face unreadable. The tapes were real. The screams weren't actors. The pain wasn't imagined. It echoed in the gallery, settling in the bones of everyone present. One recording featured David Johnson, a young man lured under false pretenses. Bunting and Wagner tortured him for hours. His voice, pleading, cracking, desperate, was played in open court. His last words were drowned in static. Some jury members asked to be excused. One vomited in the hallway. The judge called for frequent recesses, not out of legal necessity, but to let people breathe. It wasn't just the horror. It was the inescapable feeling of evil watching from every angle of that courtroom. Vlasakis described how Bunting forced him to kill his own stepbrother, Troy Yude. Bunting said Troy was useless, a problem. Vlasakis said he cried while doing it, that Bunting stood behind him, whispering that it was for the best, that Troy was better off gone. It wasn't just murder, it was psychological warfare, a process of tearing down identity and replacing it with obedience. Vlasakis didn't just lose his soul, he handed it over, piece by piece. Forensic investigators spoke next. They described the vault, the smell, the decomposition, the chemical burns. Some had to rotate shifts every 15 minutes to prevent fainting. One forensic tech recounted how she found a wedding ring at the bottom of a barrel, still clinging to what was left of a hand. She paused while testifying, her voice cracking. Even now, years later, the memory clawed at her. The vault wasn't just a crime scene, it was a wound. Barrels had warped from pressure and heat. Some leaked, some exploded when opened. Inside were limbs, torsos, skulls. Most bodies had been cut apart post-mortem, some while still alive. Hydrochloric acid had fused bones with clothing, melted cartilage into the plastic. Dental records became the only way to identify several victims. Others were recognized only through scars or birthmarks. It was the kind of evidence that stays with an investigator forever. Defense tried to argue mental illness. They claimed Bunting believed in a moral crusade, that he saw himself as a vigilante, not a killer. But the prosecution dismantled that image. They showed pictures of the spider wall. They read letters he wrote, laughing at his victims. The evidence painted a man who didn't care about justice, only domination. Bunting didn't eliminate threats. He created them, then crushed them for pleasure. Some letters written by Bunting to Wagner were read aloud. In them, Bunting fantasized about future killings, about using chainsaws, about digging a pit, about making someone disappear forever. They weren't plans for justice. They were diary entries of a sadist. One letter ended with the words, "Soon, we'll clean up another one." It wasn't just horrifying. It was methodical, rehearsed. Vlasakis broke down when discussing Elizabeth Hayden's death, Mark Hayden's own wife. She had become suspicious, asked too many questions, and then she was gone, dissolved like the rest. No ceremony, no grief, just a name scratched off the wall. Bunting had rules. No witnesses, no loose ends. Even loyalty wasn't protection. Once someone questioned him, they became a target. Even family. Jury heard 98 days of testimony, each day darker than the last. Some jurors reportedly suffered nightmares, anxiety, insomnia. The trial wasn't just about proving guilt, it was surviving it. Because the story kept unfolding, layer upon layer of cruelty. The murders were worse than expected, the motivations more deranged, and worst of all, the system never saw it coming. One psychologist described Bunting as a narcissistic sociopath with delusions of moral grandeur. Another said he displayed ritualized predatory behavior. He believed in his own mission. That was the scariest part. He wasn't trying to hide from the law. He believed he was above it, immune to it, that society would eventually understand his work. He even said once that his only regret was not doing more. When sentencing came, Bunting was given 11 consecutive life sentences. Wagner received 10. Vlasakis, who testified, received 4. Hayden got 25 years. None of them showed emotion during the verdict. No tears, no reaction, just silence. The same silence they gave their victims in death. Cold, final, and absolute. The damage wasn't over. The families were broken. Some refused to speak publicly. Others couldn't stop. They wanted the world to know what had happened, that their sons and daughters weren't just names in barrels. They were people, with lives, with stories, with laughter and fear and hopes that were crushed under the weight of ideology and violence. The town of Snowtown became infamous. Its name, once harmless, now triggered discomfort. Property values plummeted. People moved away. The bank where the vault was found was abandoned. Local businesses closed. Some residents refused to speak to journalists. Others cashed in on the infamy. But for most, it was a scar. One they didn't ask for. One they couldn't erase. What haunted people most wasn't just the number of victims. It was how close this horror came to seeming normal. The killers weren't strangers hiding in the woods. They were neighbors, relatives. They wore normal clothes, drove normal cars, said good morning at the mailbox, and behind closed doors they tortured, mutilated, and killed. Years after the trial, investigators admitted something chilling. They believed there were more victims, more barrels, but no one knew for sure. Bunting never confessed. Wagner never revealed more, and Hayden remained cryptic. There may still be bodies undiscovered, lives erased without a trace. The full truth might never be known. Started as whispers about cleansing, ended in a vault of horror. It was never about morality. It was about power, about who gets to live and who gets to disappear. And in their twisted world, Bunting and his disciples made themselves gods, judges, executioners, monsters wearing the mask of justice. Masks eventually crack, and when they did, the world saw not heroes, not saviors, but men who drowned others in acid while calling themselves good. Men who smiled while their victims begged. Men who believed they were moral, but in the end, became something far worse.